This is Common Ground with Sonja. This week, we're going to talk about victim activism for Mexico's disappeared. And my guest today is Janice Gallagher, who is currently an associate professor of political science at Rutgers University in Newark. And she's also the author of Bootstrap Justice. Welcome to the podcast, Janice.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So you have conducted research not just on disappearances in Mexico, but you've also worked with victims collectives. And this is something I wanted to touch on today in our conversation. Before we look at the Mexican context, I just wanted to remind our listeners that findings of human remains of individuals who were previously disappeared is unfortunately not a rare occurrence in Mexico. And just in March 2025, human remains were discovered at a place that is called Rancho Izaguirre, which is an abandoned farm in the state of Jalisco. How did we learn about this? A local searcher group was alerted to the site by someone who claimed to have been held captive there. And apparently this farm functioned as a training center and an extermination camp and was used by the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which is one of the major criminal groups here in Mexico. The searcher group that went to the site discovered human remains as they started to look for graves, and they've also found large quantities of shoes and clothes. The interesting aspect perhaps about the site is that the National Guard had conducted a raid in September 2024, detained 10 people, but claims not to have discovered any human remains at the time. So this is a fairly extensive site. The investigations are currently ongoing. And so this is the starting point also for our conversation with you, Janice. I wanted to ask you initially, before we look at disappearances specifically and the work of victims collectives, if you could take us to contemporary Mexico. Mexico is a formal democracy. Much has been written about this transition from an authoritarian regime to a formal democracy. But what kind of country is contemporary Mexico, specifically when we think about security and justice?
2000, we have the first democratic election, truly democratic election, and the institutional revolutionized party loses power for the first time in more than 70 years, right? So we have what civil society thinks is going to be. We have this democratic opening, this time of democratic space, and thinking that society is going to work much better. And fairly quickly, right, the hopes are really dashed. And that kind of one thing that's happening, the PRI, which is again the ruling party, so the idea that the PRI kind of controls things and has things under and is in charge of the country, that falls away right in 2000. And at the same time, the Colombian cartels had been targeted by the Colombian government, by the U.S. government in Plan Colombia, and they're increasing in power. So when Felipe Calderón comes to power in 2006, we can debate exactly why he does what he does. He sends the army to the streets, right? He says, I need to take power back from these increasingly powerful cartels. So I think a lot of us think that he probably had played favorites in terms of who he was targeting in the cartel disputes. He was favoring the Sinaloa cartel. This is why we see Chapo Guzman escape several times. But kind of regardless, I think that's a side conversation. Big picture, starting in 2006, he declares a war against drugs and he sets in motion the kind of spiral of violence, right? And his basic strategy is what he calls descabezando, like taking out the heads of the cartels. So kind of putting the most powerful leaders of the cartels in jail. But what that does is essentially create many-headed hydra, right? So by cutting off the top of the cartel, you spawn infighting amongst the cartel. And who's in the middle? Citizens, right? Who's in the middle are everyday Mexicans. And it starts this tragic cycle of violence. So Calderon kind of starts that. Mexicans get so fed up that in 2012, at the end of his 6-year period, which is called the sexenio, they vote back into power the PRI, right? Which is really tragic in and of itself. Because Mexicans decide that they are so fed up with this violence that, you know what, better go back to the times of the party of the essentially authoritarian or the perfect dictatorship. Better go backwards. But Peña Nieto, the president, then doesn't manage to get the violence under control, and by the time he leaves power, he's the least popular president in modern history. Right. So we go from him. Finally, Andrés Manuel López Obrador takes power, who's a populist with more leftist leanings and credentials. He essentially stops, at least in his discourse, stops making security the center of what he's trying to do. He gets very popular because he has policies that give money that are perceived to benefit the poor, and he's perceived not to be corrupt, which is like a pretty... Corruption is probably the biggest complaint that Mexicans have against their government. So at least he's seen as, even though the violence is kind of creeping along, and 2019 is actually the worst year in terms of disappearances, at least López Obrador is seen as not corrupt. He's not in it to make himself rich. But he doesn't get violence under control. And he, in fact, and we can again talk about why, he does not back away from the strategy of militarizing the war on drugs. He says he is addressing the underlying conditions. And I think there's something to that, but we don't really, that's a long-term project, really, to eradicate the conditions of poverty and insecurity that we know lead young people to, or part of what lead young people to join cartels. So we come into the Sheinbaum administration of 2024 with still a real huge problem in terms of violence. One thing that AMLO does at the end of his administration, and that Claudia Sheinbaum embraces, is a judicial reform, which says, you know what, judicial system is broken. At the very least, we're going to introduce judicial elections. The first ones are going to happen in June, in which we elect judges. So maybe that will help. There's a lot of pushback against that, especially by experts saying you're eroding the independence of the judiciary. And I think they're right that this erodes the independence of the judiciary. For me, though, as somebody who works kind of closely looking at the judicial processes and kind of desperately trying to figure out what to do about impunity. Impunity means the failure to sentence people for their crimes, right? So in cases of disappearances and homicides, impunity, the failure to hold anybody accountable, approaches 100%, right? So because that system is so broken, to me, the bar is so low in terms of what's going on judicially that maybe you introduce some accountability, you introduce some change, and we'll see some progress. So that's where we are, kind of coming into the Sheinbaum administration. We know that there's a certain portion of the Mexican territory where, in many ways, the definition of the state doesn't apply. The Mexican state does not have a monopoly on violence, right? We know that there's a lot of regions. And again, I'd say it is definitely not the majority of the country. It's places that tend to be closer to the U.S. border, which is where all the money and the incentives for drug production and transportation come from, as well as along illicit drug trafficking routes, right? That's where we see the clusters of violence, but we have different kind of hotspots popping up depending on the dynamics, largely between either their cartels fighting each other inside of each other, and also their relationships with the government, which I talk about somewhat in the book. So, we have, and I think Sheinbaum, besides the judicial reform, I don't want to say has no ideas about what to do, but I haven't heard anything that makes me feel like the tide is turning, right? So we are still in the midst. People talk about post-conflict. We're not post-conflict. We are mero conflicto. We're in the middle of this violence still, with, again, one of the most troubling forms of that violence being disappearances. So I think that's, Sonja, I don't know if that kind of gets us a little bit to where we are, but that's a very quick rendition of kind of what we're facing right now.
Yes, there's lots to say in terms of security and how the justice system functions or does not function. You mentioned Felipe Calderon's so-called war on drugs, which really triggered the security and human rights crisis that Mexico is facing at the moment. So if we turn to this violence now, specifically the disappearances, it's quite complicated how disappearances become labeled and classified in Mexico. And so before we look at how the Mexican state has responded in different ways to the disappearances, could you shed light a little bit on what a disappearance is, what it means in Mexico, what it means under international law?
Yeah. So disappearances became something that the term disappearances really emerges in the 70s and 80s, coming out of the experiences of different Latin American countries under military dictatorship. So kind of most famously in Chile and in Argentina, you have the government in a pretty coordinated and it's Brazil, Uruguay, it's a whole bunch of countries in Latin America that follow a very similar pattern. Essentially, these are right-wing dictatorships that come in on the heels of usually leftist governments where there was a lot of mobilization, a lot of civil society call for addressing the rampant inequality. Right? That's kind of the dynamics were that you had leftist governments trying to do something about the inequality in Latin America. Latin America is the most unequal place in the region of the world. Right, the rich it is not a poor region overall. We have the rich with a lot of money and a very small middle class and a lot of poverty, right? A lot of people that don't have access to the basics. So 70s military dictatorships come in on the heels of leftist governments, and they try to impose order, right? Both for economic and political reasons. They want to stop the mobilization that's happening, so they target the activists with the disappearances. So rather than the basic practice that comes about is that instead of killing them and making them martyrs, because when they kill them, there would be a body and there would be a rally and it would kind of spur mobilization. The whole point is to stop mobilization, to stop protests, to stop people from saying anything. So the idea of disappearing somebody was that the government literally disappears them. So kind of most famously, again, in Argentina, there were famously, you would put you would kidnap activists, drug them, and put them on a flight, and then push them out into the ocean where they would drown, right? Because they were drugged. So there would never be a body recovered, and it gave the government plausible deniability that they had done anything, and maybe even that those people ever existed, right? So it was very easy to say, no, if it was a woman, es que salió con el novio. She probably just left with her boyfriend. Or if it was a man, maybe he just went to another country to look for work, right? It's a very different time. There's no social media, right? It's harder to kind of prove what happened. And it was a way of governments skirting any domestic or international price for coordinated campaigns of extermination and political repression, right? So you got the benefits of not having those activists around without the political costs of repression, right? Like you didn't get that. That was essentially the idea that it becomes documented. It becomes we have international law passed and in response to those disappearances. But I really want to be clear. That phenomenon is called enforced disappearances. Enforced, even though it's not that intuitive, enforced implies under international law that those disappearances are undertaken by the government. There's a tricky phrase. It's either with the kind of essentially the government either directly does it or these disappearances are undertaken with the acquiescence of the government, which makes the whole term very fluid. What does the acquiescence of the government mean, right? So essentially means like maybe the government knew and could have done something to stop it, but they didn't. And depending on the political context, what people mean by enforced disappearances is different. For example, in Colombia, where I also work, nearly all disappearances, no matter who did them, are basically classified legally in the national system as enforced disappearances. That is not the case in Mexico. So Mexico is really different, right? We had a period, the Dirty War, which is basically the 1960s till the 1990s. It's a dirty war, which is what we call it in a lot of Latin American countries. That's a period where the PRI, right, the government in power, was disappearing activists, mainly in Mexico City and in the state of Guerrero. The total number of disappearances during that time, of course, we don't know exactly, but it's probably, I think it's, the government figures are about 650 people. I think NGOs think it's human rights people, and NGOs think it might be more around 2,000, but it's not higher. It's not too much higher than that, right? So that's a period where we had enforced disappearances in Mexico. 2006 marks a really different type of disappearances, right? So I talk in my book about who is actually perpetrating this violence, right? It's not really the state, and I would say it's also not exactly cartels, right? There's this idea from the outside, I think, that state and cartels are different, right? We call them different things; they're different actors, but in practice, not just recently, but historically in Mexico, criminal and government actors are really hard to distinguish. So I say there's not state and cartels or criminal actors. It's like we don't have water and land. We have this mud, right? We have this mud that really makes it impossible to pull apart. Is it the state that's disappearing somebody? And there's exceptions to these cases. I think Ayotzinapa, which we'll talk about, is an exception to this case, where we know the 43 students were disappeared by state actors. But overall, the perpetrators of these disappearances are some mix, right? So maybe it was local police that did it, and then they passed the person to the cartel, but maybe the cartel was the one who actually called for the disappearance, right? Or maybe it's the other way around. In some places, I think the government is more in control and really making cartels do their dirty work. But in most cases, the accountability for these disappearances is really mixed between the state and criminal actors, which is why I call what's happening in Mexico disappearances rather than enforced disappearances, right? Because it's not necessarily the state being responsible and targeting activists in this kind of, in the way it was happening in Latin America from about the 70s on. This changes the implications in terms of international law, and it makes it really complicated to have an accurate count of what's happening. So every state, and Mexico is a very weak federal government, and the state level justice systems have a lot of autonomy. So every state has different statutes on the book in terms of how they classify a disappearance. And really importantly, in basically every state, the low-level investigators who are the ones who receive a victim of the mother. If a mother of a disappeared young person goes to the attorney general's office in the state, which is where they would report it, they are meeting with a low-level investigator. That investigator is the one who decides what that crime is called. Now, since the general law on enforced disappearances of 2017, so prior to 2017, enforced disappearance wasn't even a thing in half of Mexican states. There was no legal statute of enforced disappearance. Since 2017, in every state, you can actually register a crime as an enforced disappearance. But if you do that, you're kind of admitting, if you think of yourself as somebody who works for the state, you're kind of implicating the state in that crime. So there's a pretty high incentive that even if a mother comes to you and says, this morning, the police came to my house, they took my son, and now I can't find him, right? I've called the police station, he's not there. I've called the army barracks, he's not there. I'd like to report him as an enforced disappearance. But the person receiving that might say, oh, that person's missing, or, oh, that person has been illegally deprived of their liberty, or that person was kidnapped, right? Even though definition of a kidnap is that some ransom would have been asked for, right? So, but because of this power to decide that the local investigators have, there is no coherent way that disappearances are registered in Mexico, which means getting an accurate count. So it means it leads to a whole bunch of chaos, which I would say is a pretty deliberate chaos, right? It means in this chaos, it means it's really hard to understand how many cases there are, which again, gives the government plausible deniability of how many cases of disappearances there are. It's really hard to know. So I spent a very long time making lots of spreadsheets, which in the end, in my book, I essentially ignored because I think that the quality of information coming from The state level prosecutor's office is really low, right? So it's really hard to figure out what is happening in those cases. Are there actually investigations happening? Has anybody been charged? Has anybody been brought to trial, convicted, and actually put in jail? All of those things are really murky. You throw in there the complication that in most Mexican investigations, the predominant way of extracting information is through torture, which means people are lying all the time. It means that understanding what is happening, who's doing what to whom, we are still not there. However many years, right? Almost 20 years into this devastating violence, we still don't know those very basic things. On top of that, the law on enforced disappearances calls for a national database, not only of who is disappearing, but also of their DNA, right? But those databases do not exist, and they are not linked in a comprehensive and in a way that has integrity, which is why, so we have all these remains that were found on this abandoned in the Rancho Aguirre, right? So you'd think, okay, so the next thing we should do is to take the DNA from those bone fragments and plug it into a national database that must exist. It does not, right? So we do not have a trustworthy national database still, even though that's required by law in 2017, we don't have that. So there's a lot of, and again, I would say that is essentially by design, right? Like in terms of what it would really take to get a handle on what is happening and try to initiate some processes of accountability. That's kind of where we are. So I don't know, Sonja, I expanded from the initial question, but I think it's important, I think, to talk about enforced disappearances, given that we don't have credible reporting mechanisms, we don't have a credible database, and we don't have credible information is really folly, right? We don't know so much about what's going on. Again, I think Rancho Izaguirre is gives us information we've been hungry for in terms of what are the, we're seeing some details that we haven't gotten in a lot of cases. I think the missing part is exactly how did that keep happening and why wasn't it secured? What is the involvement in or collusion in allowing that to happen of both local, state, and national authorities?
In your research, you spent a considerable effort looking at victims' collectives, and you follow some families who ended up looking for loved ones who had disappeared. And I think the official response to disappearances, to the magnitude that the issue of disappearances has taken on in Mexico, helps us better understand why it is that families actually decided that they had to go look for missing persons themselves rather than leaving this job to the state. And so later on, I would like to ask you to share one of those stories. They're all revealing in different ways, but I'd like to focus on one story later on. Before we do so, could you speak a little bit about the impact that a disappearance, or in some cases, several disappearances in the same family has on that family? What happens when a person disappears?
Thanks for that question. I think there's a lot of different ways I could have conducted research. I was living in Mexico from about 2011 to 14 and came back, was here in 2010 and came back a lot afterwards. So I was kind of here as the phenomenon, I don't want to call it a phenomenon, as the tragedy of disappearances really kind of emerged. In 2010, it wasn't clear that there was a epidemic of disappearances. It's really not until 2011 and 12 and really 2014 that we really realized what's happening. But what led me to this work were these mobilizations, right, that were happening, especially. And so in 2012, we had about, who knows how many, but about 100,000 people show up in the Zócalo, in the main plaza in Mexico City, saying we've had it, right? This is the violence is too much. And I started kind of following that movement and going to their meetings. And the people that I met at those meetings, the people who were kind of most vocal and most active, and most devastated, were people whose family members had disappeared. I guess I had just lost my own father, and so I think I was grieving, and I was very sensitive to kind of what they were, who died of cancer, right? Natural causes. I think what really hit home for me was they weren't just dealing with the kind of loss that I was dealing with, which is a huge loss for me, right? They weren't just dealing with the fact that their loved one wasn't with them. The daily uncertainty of, were they suffering, right? What was happening to them upended their lives in ways that was total, right? I think for the people, especially, I mean, a lot of people don't mobilize, but the people I was meeting, day was night, night was a day, everything was upside down for them, just in terms of the emotional impact of the person who's closest to you. Again, not just having, which is a huge loss, but the uncertainty every day that they might be enduring just unimaginable suffering, was this turning point in their lives. And I know we're going to get there, but I selected, from the book, I focus on 3 families. And I selected 3 families. So I met hundreds of families, and I'm just incredibly indebted to their generosity and speaking with me and kind of trusting me during the time that I was working here. But I chose 3 families who were economically in really different positions, right? I chose that there was a wealthier couple whose son, Alejandro Morena Vaca, was disappeared while he was on his way to the United States to buy a computer, and he was stopped on the highway and disappeared. And essentially, we don't know anything that happened. And they were a wealthy couple. Lucia talks about her life prior to this disappearance as kind of living in a Disneyland, right? So kind of for them, it stops, right? It's kind of night and day before and after that. And then I talk about Juan Carlos Trujillo, who has 4 brothers who were disappeared at 2 different times. And again, he went from having a thriving family business. Both sets of brothers, they disappeared 2 at a time in 2008 and 2010. They were disappeared, kind of doing the work of the family work, which was buying and selling gold door to door throughout the Mexican territory. And again, it kind of goes from a family business, then things are thriving, and they are kind of scraping, like they're, I wouldn't say scraping by, they're kind of energetically kind of trying to get ahead economically. It goes from that to kind of full stop, right? Especially for his mom. It becomes just a totally paralyzing experience. So what I was seeing, it represented a before and an after, right? Kind of life stopped being the life that they knew before, in just an incredibly devastating way. So that's the emotional impact. I think what we started to see as time went on, and it became kind of years, as months turned into years, turned into multiple years that people have been disappeared. In a lot of cases, the people who disappeared were a really important part economically of the family. So the kind of the economic devastation was incredibly strong for a lot of families. That's led to a focus on getting a declaration. So because they're disappeared, not killed, a lot of insurance companies wouldn't pay out, essentially. So it's become really important to have a declaration of absence be recognized as kind of a legal figure. So those are kind of some of the things that we see in these families. So just an incredibly high economic and emotional toll on them.
The families you work with most closely, it seems that they had never contemplated being activists. And you also mentioned how this uncertainty about the fate of the disappeared person really is one factor that drives these families to do something. Yeah. But even so, many families don't mobilize. So for the families you worked with, what is it you found? How did these families analyze the Mexican context, and what ultimately contributed to turning them into activists?
So again, really different from the enforced disappearances that we're talking about, both from Mexico in the Dirty War and in the rest of Latin America in the 70s and 80s. Because those people were activists, usually their families knew what they were doing. Often they supported it, and they had been to protests. They were people who had heard all these political terms before, right? So there were people kind of who pretty intuitively knew how to turn their desperation about what had happened into political action, right? It was a much kind of, not easier, but a more kind of logical stepping stone because they had political education, they had political consciousness, they regarded themselves as politicized people. For the vast majority of people I met, and again, I should say, just to contextualize it, most people I met was through the Movement for Peace with Justice and Dignity, which is this movement that is born in 2011 in the wake of the killing of Javier Sicilia's son. Javier Sicilia was a nationally recognized poet and syndicated columnist, and his son, who is a very kind of classically, he was wealthy, he was this kind of robust youth, an athlete, and he was killed in a nightclub, right? So the country kind of looks at Javier Sicilia and it's in a very light-skinned, in a country that it's still colorist in many ways, his wealthy, kind of well-to-do son. When he's killed, the government had kind of been saying, it's really not that bad. It's really, if people are being hurt in any way, es porque estaban en algo. It's because they were involved in something bad. So you should really just blame the victim. So I'm saying this because I think it's relevant to the question, right? So when Javier Sicilia's son is killed, people are like, okay, that's not what's happening, right? If he could die, right? If he was killed, something bigger is going on. So that's actually a really important part of how people start making sense of what's happening to their loved ones. Because they're like, before, a lot of people were doubting themselves, right? The government was saying, es porque estaban en algo. It's because they did something wrong. They're like, well, maybe that is true, right? Maybe they were, they were just at a casino. I did one interview that really rocked me. I interviewed the vocero, the spokesperson for the Nuevo León governor at the time. And he was talking about looking for his nephew, and he was helping search for him. And he said, well, then I discovered my nephew was going to the casino often and he smoked cigarettes. So then I thought, I was like, well, better stop looking, because it was like, for him, that was enough to criminalize him. That was enough to basically say, well, I guess he was doing something wrong. So I think for a lot of people decide to mobilize, it's really helpful that civil society starts saying, they didn't deserve that. Right. Even if, like in the case of Nancy, which I'll talk about more, her 18-year-old son, was in a drug addiction clinic. Right. So even though he had used drugs, there's a change in the way that most Mexicans, they are starting to think about what's happening around between 2010 and 2014, that they have the right to speak up. They have the right to say something, even if because everybody deserves justice. So I think that's important in terms of context. But in terms of kind of like what leads most people down this road. So I think it's a time when people are disappeared. I think for me, every family that has somebody disappeared, pretty much everybody wants to do something at first. So how does it turn out that in the end, only a very small percentage of people end up mobilizing? I think first you have that impetus to mobilize, but in order to actually kind of keep going, certain things have to be true, right? So they have to have a life that allows them to mobilize. If you are an average kind of lower middle class or poor person or middle class person, you have to work during the day. And in order to actually mobilize, you can't have a full-time job, because these mobilizations and all these exhaustive meetings with state officials are happening during the day. So I think I did a bunch of surveys and kind of quantitative work to try to figure out how people are mobilizing. How are they different than the general population? And they generally skew either richer or poorer, because if you're very poor or very rich, you probably don't have to work, right? So you're more likely to be at the extremes, and you're more likely to be either young or old, again, because people who are kind of middle-aged and working 9 to 5s really can't mobilize. So I think part of it is, right, do you have what I call biographical availability? Another is, do you know anybody who's ever been to a protest, right? Again, because these aren't people who are coming from politicized contexts, the idea of going to a protest is pretty weird, right? So do you know anybody who went there? And then so Nancy sees Javier Sicilia on the news. She says she never watched the news, but that night she happened to watch the news, and he was saying in very plain language, this is unacceptable. Come out and join me. and we're going to try to do something about what's happening. So, but it was pretty random that she actually heard about that, because people's social networks didn't include, none of the people I know had social networks that included people who were protesting. So you have to figure out some link into that. And I think then there's also a lot of people who decided that they wanted to keep coming out. What they kept hearing from their other family members is like, what are you doing? The only thing you're going to do is invite more violence to our family. So I think there's in political science, there's a concept called pleasure and agency, right? Basically, the idea is people who end up mobilizing long term have to feel like they are, like it's important that they're out there, and it's more important that they're out there than even their risk of violence on them and their family does increase when they mobilize. It is not negligible, the amount of violence that happens to people who start to mobilize. So there has to be something inside of them that says, you know what, the risk is worth it, right? Like it's not exactly a cost benefit analysis, because it's not about money, but it is about it's emotionally intense to be mobilizing. If people keep mobilizing, they have to tell their stories over and over, which is an exhausting thing to do. So they have to decide kind of that the benefits of mobilizing outweigh the costs. The last thing I talk about, and this is to me, those are all the concepts that are kind of out there. One of the things that I tried to say in the book is all that could be true, but you still have to have an ability, essentially, to change the way you're thinking about the state, right? To change the way you're thinking about these processes. It's one thing to go out there and protest, but for the people who engage in what I called sustained mobilization, they're out there for years and years and having just endless meetings. You have to start thinking about the state not as all good and not as all bad. A lot of people describe, so the richer people, unsurprisingly, were kind of like, yeah, state's pretty good. If you act right, the state, you'll kind of have a life that works and the state will respect you. Nancy, on the other hand, who I haven't talked about yet, but Nancy, again, was a single mom. She had supported her and her only son by selling cactus in the market for a while and doing kind of sewing on the side. And for her, she had always been very scared of the state. So for people who thought the state was all bad or the state was all good, they had to change the way they thought about the state. They had to start interacting with the state and seeing like, okay, there's small wins to be had, right? It makes sense for me. And it's something that I want to do to figure out kind of how to find people in the state who are willing to work with me. So you had to have the capacity to change the way you think about the state, about justice, kind of about these, what were before really abstract concepts. Those become incredibly central to these people's lives. So that's kind of another part of what I say is required to actually continue to mobilize.
When we look at the work of civil society, I think most often what we hear about is the actual searches that the victims collectives are conducting across the country. But it seems that the families and the victims collectives, of course, have a very diverse set of strategies in order to try to track down disappeared persons. What are these strategies?
So I think these strategies have changed over time, right? They've evolved. At first, it was protests, right? People were on the street, and I think that continues to be something that everybody does. So, for example, on Mother's Day, you have probably the largest protests of the year. So everybody agrees that it's important to show that there is a constituency that cares about disappearances, that wants to hold the state accountable. So I think that was the first thing, right? But everything has evolved kind of in response to the failure of that strategy to actually give the results people want. So when that wasn't working, they're like, okay, we're on the streets. The state knows that we are upset about what's happening. Is that going to change things? Not so much. So the next thing was to start having meetings with the state. So and this is really, I would say, protests are happening. I mean, they're ongoing, but really the Movement for Peace protests, and then the protests of 2014 in the wake of the disappearance of the 43 students. Those reveal that protests are not enough, and they start having mesas de trabajo, which are essentially, I call them kind of collaborative working groups. So the state starts saying, okay, please leave our front porch, right? Stop going on a hunger strike in front of our offices, come in, and we're going to sit down with you and go over these cases, right? And we're not going to just do it today. We're going to have meetings every month. So in almost every state in Mexico, where you have disappearances, which is about half of the states roughly, you have these from the outside, it's pretty wild how justice works, right? It's not, you don't have an investigator going in and interviewing people and then coming back and figuring out if there's enough evidence to do a trial. What you have is really citizen-led searches, citizen-led investigative groups where you have every month or two around the same table, you have the Ministerio Público, who's like the public investigator, along with maybe relevant members of the police. You might have even members of the military. You might have members of local human rights commissions and search commissions, which are both state entities. So they all might be at the table together with a nonprofit organization or NGO, human rights organization, and members of the victim's family. And they're all sitting together every month or two and saying, okay, what has been done since the last meeting? And what needs to be done? You said, public minister, that you were going to pull the photos of everybody who was admitted into all the local prisons in the 6 months after my son was disappeared. Have you done that? Right? And then the prosecutor says to the family member, you said you were going to talk with the cousin who doesn't want to speak to us, but it was with your son the day before he was disappeared. Has that been done? Right? So everybody's checking in about exactly where the investigation stands, right? And I think that's still ongoing. That's happening more. That's increasingly the way that disappearances are investigated, especially in terms of the more recent disappearances. But as you can imagine, those working groups, if somebody disappeared in 2010, by 2014 or 15, all the leads have been run down, right? So it becomes more apparent to the family members of the victims that institutional process is not going anywhere. So what are they going to do? They're going to look for their family members, both alive, but also look for their remains, right? The Ayotzinapa disappearances are really what explodes this strategy. So if you'll remember, and I've again referenced it a couple of times, I don't want to be repetitive, but so September 2014, 43 students are disappeared by local police. With the involvement of a local cartel and the military, right? I think we know that all of them are involved. Since then, 2, maybe 3 sets of remains have been found of the students, and other than that, we don't know what has happened to the students, right? But what happens after that is it is a moment of national reckoning. There's another set of huge protests, and people start looking for graves in Guerrero, right? In the state where the students were disappeared. And they don't find the 43 students. Again, they find the remains of 2 or 3 students, but that takes a while. But they find more than 200 other remains, right? So this group emerges called Los Otros Desaparecidos, the other disappeared. And these are family members of not the students, but of other people who were disappeared in Guerrero. And they kind of set in motion this strategy of primarily focusing on looking for remains. Juan Carlos Trujillo, who I talk about in the book, learns from the leaders of Los Otros Desaparecidos some of the tactics that you can use when you're looking for remains. And I should say there were other groups doing this before. There was a group centered in Tijuana led by Fernando Segueda. So there were other civil society groups who had done it beforehand. But in 2014, it really kind of takes center stage. And because 2010 to 12 was an incredibly violent time, there's a lot of remains. A lot of families were reaching the end of their hope that the investigation would find them and kind of saying, you know what, we got to take this into our own hands and look for people, and look for people in tierra, right? Look for people on the land. There's a lot of groups that form. Most of these 200 collectives I'm talking about engage in some kind of searching. I think one thing that's been really interesting, we've seen a lot of solidarity among those groups, even though the groups are fairly small and located all over Mexico. They have joined together in groups like Unidos para Nuestros Desaparecidos, United for Our Disappeared. And the idea is together, they join together and go to somewhere where they know there might be a lot of disappeared people. They lead, they call them search brigades. So it's like, 100 people all going to one area where they think there might be remains and searching for a week, right? Kind of digging and doing work that is, Juan Carlos, I think, describes it. I have some quotes from him in the book where he's talking about what it is to do that work. I mean, he talks about, I'm not in this to become a investigator or a politician who understands all of the underlying things. But if I can kind of put my hands in the ground where I think that my loved ones, where my brothers might be, that feels like kind of grounded in a very different way. So that has become a really important strategy. But I would say, for almost all of those collectives, it's definitely not the only one, right? So we have the other things that I talked about, protesting and marching, having these meetings. There's kind of extraordinarily, these meetings have led to the involvement of citizens in ways that would probably surprise you. So in the book I talk about for Lucia and Alfonso, they push for and kind of succeed in getting state forces to send drones over some of the cartel-controlled area where they think that their son might be. Nancy actually goes on raids with the state agents to, her son was disappeared from a drug treatment clinic. She goes on raids with the head of that clinic, searching for both her son and other people that she knows were harmed in those drug treatment clinics. So I think so you have citizens doing things that you wouldn't think that they would do. And it's partially because of the lack of capacity of the state to do it itself. And I think a really important part of this is that they are, even in these search brigades, I should say, it's not that these search brigades are totally independent. Often, if not usually, they're inviting people from the state to come with them, partially because they want to preserve the integrity of any bodies that they find, right? So the relationship between the people who are looking in looking kind of in fields and in on ranches for disappeared people are not kind of unilaterally against the state. Often they have built relationships with somebody they trust within the state, and they say, please come and accompany us. It makes us safer, and it gives a different type of integrity to our searching process. So that's another important part, is recognizing that the state is not all good or bad, and there's some some allies within the state that they can make, and that will help them do that. So I think they're employing all of these strategies, right? All of these strategies, which in combination they hope will at least help locate their loved ones, hopefully alive. And but also for them, it's really important to have the closure of having a body, of having a piece of their loved one, to know what happened to them, to know they're not suffering anymore, and to bury. Right. So I think those are the things that I saw people doing.
One of the mothers you worked with is called Nancy. She goes looking for her son, who disappears from a drug treatment center. And I think it's quite striking how she undergoes this transformation from a single mother who works hard to raise her son to eventually becoming an activist. What is Nancy's story?
So, Nancy Raquel Rosete is, as you said, she is a single mom. She came from a pretty violent context. So interestingly, her father was a police officer, right? And so, but from a very early age, he mistreated the family. He was violent with the family, and they would try to get away from him. And through his kind of police contacts, he would always find them. So Nancy was really raised like, I would never go to the state. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid the police, because what I saw in my own family was that they bring us nothing but violence. So she's kind of raised in violence. She escapes her home at a fairly young age, and with her partner becomes pregnant and has her one and only child, Elvis Axel Torres Rosete, but fairly soon after he is born, her spouse is violent, and she again needs to flee, right? So she is somebody who has had violence in one way or the other. She kind of figures out how to support him and her. They move into a fairly modest bedroom community to Mexico City, so she has to commute several hours to work often, but she kind of makes it work one way or the other. Finally, she feels like Elvis is kind of doing well. He's almost out of high school, but he is using marijuana and he is sniffing glue. So I guess I say that specifically, he wasn't using heroin. He wasn't, but she decides she wants the best for him. And she wants to kind of set him up for success in his life. And she encourages him to seek drug treatment. She looks for a drug treatment center. In Mexico, drug treatment centers are pretty much unregulated. So she finds a place that sounds really good. It breaks my heart every time I say it, but the drug treatment center is called Salva tu Vida, save your life, right? Which feels like particularly cruel given what happens next. He's in drug treatment. He is, they're in good communication. He's sending her notes saying, Mom, this was hard, but this is the right thing. Thank you for sending me here. She has to make sacrifices to send him there. Her partner at the time has to sell his truck in order to afford drug treatment. So it really feels to her like she's doing the right thing. And then on December 28th, 2010, she gets a really awful call from the head of the drug treatment center who says, Elvis Axel, I don't know where he is. He went out on an errand with two other young men, and I don't know where he is. And like pretty soon, it becomes clear to Nancy that the guy who called her, the head of the drug treatment center, isn't being truthful with her about what happened. And she's like, wait, on an errand? How? What do you mean on an errand? He is in your care. He's 18. He's in your care. And I think what it seems like happened is that the head of the drug treatment center was actually using the people at the drug treatment center as drug mules, right? Essentially using them to run drugs and also to bring other young people into the treatment center where he would get money from them, but also kind of essentially have them engage in dangerous and illegal activities. At first, Nancy doesn't go to the police, unsurprisingly, given kind of what her experience had been. She resists doing that. Someday, I think it's about 10 days after the disappearance, she meets with her family. They finally decide she should go to the police. She goes to the police and they won't even take her report, right? So in Mexico, you go and report it, but then you have to sign it in order to kind of make it an official report. She has to do that 3 separate times before the police actually take the report. By then, a couple weeks have passed, right? And there's been no investigation. So she's super frustrated, realizing that she hasn't heard from Elvis Axel. She doesn't know what to do. She kind of goes and she has trying to figure out what to do. She contacts a member of the press. And then when she does that, she's called into the Attorney General's office, who hasn't talked to her essentially till then. And she's scolded for engaging with a member of the press who engages in yellow journalism. And he essentially threatens her and tells her to be quiet. She works with a local civil society organization, which she pretty soon again figures out is pretty corrupt. They want her to pay for things. They're making her do cleaning. She's like, this is not like they realize that when she tells her story, it's very powerful. So they have her kind of going out and talking to groups, but she's not, again, that's not getting her any closer to knowing where Axel is. And she enters into a really deep depression. Nancy tries to commit suicide, I think, twice, if not 3 times. And it kind of centers around especially around these early days of looking for her son, where she's just devastated, just really devastated, thinking about where he might be and what to do about his disappearance. Kind of fast forward, after these experiences, she finally turns on the TV one day and she sees Javier Cecilia, right? So we're talking about 2011. And she finally sees the leader of this social movement saying, come out. Actually, it was early 2012 by the time she sees him. And I was at the event that she came to. And she basically hears Javier Cecilia says, okay, I'm going to give it another try, right? What is there to lose? It's been more than a year. It's been a year and a few months since her son had disappeared. And she comes and she sits next to Javier Cecilia at this event in Mexico City, and she says, "Help me, right? My son has been disappeared. I have no idea what to do." And kind of from there, she joins the movement for peace, and that kind of sets in motion this journey for her. I actually took her testimony when she first came to the movement for peace. That's how I met her. I was volunteering with them at the time, and she talks about that meeting as she could barely speak. Right, for her, she cried all the time. Right, she was so devastated. It was really, she talks. For me, it's very interesting, actually. Nancy and the other people in my book all talk about this journey from not having a voice. And for her, it was a literal incapacity to say words, because when she would talk about him, she was so overcome by despair, right? By sadness about what was happening. Kind of little by little, she starts going to some of the events held by people in the movement for peace. She starts talking to other people who are going through the same thing. She talks about, so the movement for peace at the time is engaging in all these different protest activities, and she wouldn't even know kind of what was happening, and she would go there. She also starts to meet other people from where she's from, which is the state of Mexico, and she kind of realizes that she is good both at talking to those people and at she starts keeping very informal but really important logs of everybody's case and what the government is saying to them, and kind of what their experiences are. So she kind of becomes a de facto leader of victims who are by victims, I mean other people whose family members have been disappeared in the state of Mexico. And kind of little by little, she's learning, right? She has her first protest. She sponsors her first protest. She almost cancels it the day before. She has no idea how to organize a protest. And she thinks that they're going to get shut down and thrown off the streets because she didn't get the right permit, but it happens, and press is there, and it works. But she's pretty stopped, right, in terms of actually accessing the state government. Like many other victims, when she goes to the state government, again, they first had refused to take the report, and then she tries to get a meeting with them. They won't even let her see the case file of what's happening. That's very common, right? When people don't go kind of with power and with a group, the state prosecutors won't even let them look at the case files of what's happening, which they have every right to do. So she's kind of stopped there. So when that happens, the movement for peace decides to do, not as a result, but kind of overall, because things are so frustrating, a group of people decide to have a plantón, which is essentially like a ongoing sit-in and hunger strike outside of the federal attorney general's office. And Nancy becomes one of the leaders of that hunger strike. To break that hunger strike, the attorney general's office guarantees the people who are on hunger strike that she will facilitate these mesas de trabajo, these meetings with the state government. So again, these meetings with the state governments that are happening, I was talking about, those were won through maybe not blood, but definitely sweat and tears, right? Those are won through mobilization. That is not something the governments were just like, oh, okay, we're going to open our doors and let you and kind of receive you. So she finally gets contact through that because she was on having a hunger strike. She finally gets to sit down with the state prosecutors. And from there, the way they treat her really changes. She says, instead of kind of making them sit on hard chairs and 8-hour meetings with no water, they start treating them nicer. And she's like, well, that's not really the results I want. And so you can see her, just to pause, right? This is somebody scared of police before, never has been a politicized person. Now she's going to protest, she's organizing protests, she's on a hunger strike, and now she's the leader of a group of victims in her home state, and she's sitting with the governor, and she's saying to the governor, this is not enough, right? You're giving me atole con el dedo. I really like that expression. You're giving me soup on your finger. You're just giving us a teeny bit and pretending that's enough, and it's not enough. We need results. We need real action in these cases. And she really transforms her relationship with the state through her mobilization. I brought her up to New Jersey for the launch of my book because I wanted her voice to be the one that was heard, not mine. And she insisted on bringing the MEP, the Ministerio Público, which is the essentially the investigator on her case, with her to the book launch because she wants him to talk about how they've worked together to get results in the case. And I should say in her case, it's fast forwarding through a lot, but the head of the clinic is in jail. I believe it's for kidnapping, not disappearance, but at least he is in jail, partially for what he did to her son. So she goes from, kind of being somebody who has been systematically disempowered, somebody who has lived with so much violence, into somebody who has, I would say, kind of in every form, is an incredibly effective advocate, not only for her son, but for other disappeared people. And I think she talks in pretty moving ways about she's accepted that her son may not be alive, and what she's doing in her activism now is carrying on his legacy, trying to help other people in the same situation and prevent this from happening. She also has, since she came to the US, we did a lobby day in Washington where she was talking about it was really powerful to see her, to be with her as she presented her case and what had happened to lawmakers in the United States. And she's become a really outspoken advocate for limiting the trafficking of weapons from the United States to Mexico, because we know that most of the guns that kill people in Mexico are from the US. So she's become a really outspoken, using her story, has become really outspoken on that issue as well. So she's really kind of transformed as a person. So there's a lot of desolation. And I don't want to paint it as a rosy picture. She doesn't know where her son is, even though the perpetrator is in jail. She's gotten to meet with him several times, and he won't tell her. He won't meet with her, and he won't tell her what happened until the Saxel. And that remains her goal. But her life has been transformed, and I would say she, in turn, is a real, and I don't think she's remarkable in many ways, and in many stories, her story is the story of hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who kind of through force of will and kind of who they are to me are the only actor, or the only people, institutional or otherwise, who are really making a dent in terms of moving the needle on impunity and on justice in Mexico. So that's I don't know if that covers it. If there's anything else I can say about Nancy, Sonja.
You explained how many of the families and the victims collectives work really hard to find out what happened to the disappeared persons, how they try to kickstart investigations, how they actually search for the disappeared. So far, what are the results of this victim activism?
That's a really good question. I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is because the easiest answer is nothing, right? Like, we still don't know where these people are, and people still aren't going to jail for it. So nothing's been accomplished. And I think we don't have the luxury of that black and white thinking, right? I think the scale of the problem, So I think overall the scale of the problem remains overwhelmingly awful and unacceptable. And I don't want the takeaway from the book to be a rosy or kind of naive, like, well, just mobilize and things are going to get better, because things are still really bad, right? We saw that with the Rancho Isaguirre, right? I mean, this is a demonstration of how bad things are. That said, there have been huge changes when we think about what was possible in 2010 or 11 or 12, and what does somebody confront now when their loved one is disappeared versus what did they confront then? It's really night and day. I think first, we have a real challenging of this narrative blaming the victim. That narrative is still out there, right? But we have the victims movement has challenged that narrative together, I should say, with some incredible journalists. Marcela Turati's work, Daniela Pastrana. There's amazing journalists who have led the way and stopped essentially accepting the government's narrative and started telling the stories of people who had been disappeared. So I think kind of the victims, with the help of sympathetic journalists, have really presented a counter narrative in terms of victims deserve justice. I think there's still a tension with, there's still a tendency to want to paint all victims as the innocent ones, and like as there's good victims and bad victims. But again, the victims movement, to its credit, hasn't fallen prey to that overall. I think it's there's an acknowledgement at the heart of the victims movement that everybody, even if they were, if they were in some ways collaborating or had, contact with cartels, they still deserve justice. They still deserve to have their cases investigated. So presenting a counter narrative to it's the victim's fault and therefore we don't have to do anything. I think that's been a really important thing. There has been huge kind of important pieces of national legislation passed. First, the Victims Law, and second, the law on disappearances. I should say, so the Victims Law essentially says if you have a family member that's been affected by violence, you're entitled to some compensation and help from the state. And the law on disappearances, which really importantly includes both enforced disappearances and the long name of the law acknowledges both enforced disappearances and people who were disappeared by non-state actors. It guarantees them. So it guarantees them everything you'd want. It's really a dream law that civil society authored. It guarantees them a well thought out strategic investigation. It includes it guarantees kind of national level databases that are coordinated with DNA, with available DNA. With the DNA of the victims and the DNA of people who've been found. And it guarantees immediate looking. So one thing that's true in Mexico as well as many other countries, if somebody's reported missing, there's a 72-hour waiting period often. The law on disappearances says, nope, you need to investigate immediately, which is hugely important because those first days are the most crucial in terms of the investigation, as you can imagine. So they passed a beautiful law, as we've already talked about. The problem is that law has not been fully implemented, or maybe, has I don't know, 30% of it has been implemented. But that law also created new state bureaucracies dedicated to searching for victims. So it's incredibly important that now at least it's on the books, right? Enforced disappearance, as I said, wasn't even a crime in at least half of states before that was passed. So that's given rise to these new bureaucracies. So we have, at least kind of as part of the state, we have search commissions in every single state in Mexico. And we also have commissions created by the Victims Law. We have the Comisión de Atención a Víctimas, the committees dedicated to victim attention also in every state. And you have some cases that are breaking through, right? We have the discovery of remains. We have the discovery of a lot of, I think, over 2,500 mass graves in the country, largely as a result of the dynamics initiated by these victim collectives. And although, again, data is terrible, I did a kind of an in-depth look in the state of Nuevo León. I kind of embedded with the NGO there to kind of, I argue that if it wasn't going to happen in Nuevo León, it wouldn't happen anywhere else because we had state actors who were very much wanting to do something. Anyway, in Nuevo León, there's about 265 people who were disappeared. And I want to say in about 20% of those cases, people were located. Most of them were remains. Most of them weren't located alive. But for those 20% of cases, that's both kind of heartbreakingly low, but also it totally transforms the lives of those 40 or 50 families who can know what happened to their loved one. So there's not enough wins, there's not enough good news, but even the finding of remains again is solace for these families and helps them have some closure. So I think it's the victims movement has done nothing less than transform the institutional and legal landscape in Mexico, and they've given us and they've kind of pioneered the way a way forward in terms of how to struggle for this. In the book, I have an interview with a woman I believe I met in 2019, and her sister had disappeared. She had kind of come across one of the collectives, and she said, "So I met this collective, and then they told me, here are the 5 things you do. You start going to the protests, and you have the meetings with the state, and she's like, so I did all the things, right? I did these 5 things, and it was really kind of eye-opening for me because in 2011 or 2012, that was people had no idea what to do, right? There wasn't kind of a playbook for, okay, here are all the strategies that we've developed, and a lot of them were backed by legal precedent, and the state is obligated to do these things. Now there's a whole kind of set of actions and handbooks and organizations that have been created to support the people who are going through this. It is not enough. They are underfunded. They're under attack often, but they exist, and that's a step forward. So I want to both recognize their, I think, really incredible progress, and also not end on a. It's not a positive note exactly, right? I think they've done incredible work, and it's still an incredibly difficult and devastating problem in Mexico. But they're working incredibly hard to try to address it.
To conclude this episode, Janice, I would like to invite the final reflection from you, and I would like to put 2 points to you for your consideration. If you circle back for a moment to Rancho Izaguirre, of course, there has been widespread indignation, which has also existed in other impactful cases, such as Ayotzinapa. And perhaps my question for you would be, how can we maintain this level of social indignation so that there's more constant pressure for change? And at the same time, I would like you to look at the political situation in Mexico. You mentioned when you discussed the drug war that we have seen different political parties in power. We have had the PAN, the PRI, and currently it's Morena. But paradoxically, even though the two Morena governments consider themselves to be on the left, in a way it seems they are disappearing. They disappeared again by manipulating statistics. What do you think this means for activism, specifically victim activism, when there is a government that claims to be on the left, that claims to work for the people, but again is failing victims?
Yeah. So I think it's really important that they claim to be for victims. I mean, so Calderón and Peña Nieto weren't even claiming it, right? So I think the change in discourse at the national level, I think, is really striking, right? So I conclude the book with, I went to, I think it was 2022 or 21. I went to an event at the former, what would be the former White House, right? The president's, what would used to be the president's residence, which was, he had turned into a public space, and there were victim activists who had been, and notably, it wasn't kind of the highly educated, professionalized human rights activists that before would be the only representatives invited. It was actual madres buscadoras. It was mothers who were leading, mothers of disappeared people who were leading these collectives. So the fact that the government is, at least, I think what I'm talking about, both AMLO and what we've seen from Sheinbaum, both of them are, at least in rhetoric, less likely to only criminalize the victims, right? I think that matters in terms of how easy it is to deny them justice and how vulnerable they are. So rhetoric matters, and it's obviously not enough, right? I think using that rhetoric, and basically what the victims organizations are doing is saying, okay, you're saying you're on our side. Here's what that means in terms of concrete actions. I think I'm a little discouraged. I think since Rancho Izaguirre, Sheinbaum came back with kind of some proposals, and essentially all of them were already in the victims' law or in the law on disappearances, and the victims were like, no, legal. So again, I think Mexico actually has some very beautiful jurisprudence overall in terms of international law, and specifically in the issue area of disappearances. It's not a legal problem, right? The law is there. The problem is the implementation. I think it'll be really interesting what happens after the June judicial elections, right? I think in terms of what people run on and whether those are that, I think it presents a moment for the victims to really center the importance of addressing the impunity in these cases, right? And these are mediatic. That's what you say in Spanish. That's not really an English word. These are kind of a lot of these cases they obviously provoke the sympathies of Mexican people. It's why these collectives have been so effective. I think for the collectives to try to figure out how to use people's sympathies in order to politically have power in these judicial elections, if that makes sense, is going to be. I think that's going to be really interesting how that plays out. And I think it does present an opportunity, and it also can present an opportunity for the capture of those judges by corrupt politicians as well as by cartels. Right. So I think keeping the importance of and the integrity of their struggle through the judicial elections is actually going to be a really big deal. I was discouraged by Sheinbaum so far because to me it shows that she doesn't have the right people around her talking about this. Right? There's not. She doesn't have. These were kind of, to me, kind of easily avoidable errors in terms of how to respond to that. I think there's always a question about is the lack of state response, is it about state capacity or willingness, right? Is the state unwilling to do anything? Or are they incapable? And for me, we've seen a little bit of evidence of incapacity. So for the victims, proposing people to go in to occupy kind of key roles and trying to put allies into key state positions is also going to be a really important, something that's really important. I guess in terms of those, in terms of the prospects for change, after Ayotzinapa, I created a website and was tracking all of the responses. And now that I'm 11 years more jaded, for me, if there was going to be a moment where we were going to see things change, I really thought after Ayotzinapa we were going to see some change, and was am devastated that we didn't see the type of change that we thought we would. So I'm a little jaded that this is good, that this moment leads to big change. But I think figuring out how do you institutionalize, how do you change institutions when you have moments of higher societal pressure? I mean, that's not to sound too political sciencey, but again, putting allies in government, because it's not legal changes that we need right now, but that we don't need to use this moment to get legal changes, but trying to get allies in key positions who we think are going to do the work. And that, we have high government officials expressing their support for it is really important. In terms of the international community, I think we're at a political moment to talk about the elephant in the room. What does it mean that the U.S. is abandoning any facade of caring about human rights right now? I think there's some opportunities there in terms of, I think, Mexico as a center-left country asserting that it, unlike its northern neighbor, does care about human rights. I think that's an identity that I see as our political position that's really salient right now. So I think victims organizations holding the government to account, saying, you're saying that you're different than our northern neighbor. You're saying you respect human rights. Let's see the evidence of that, right? Let's see you actually do what it takes. I think there's a political framing there that could be effective. And I hope that gives some political space for victims to work in. But again, I think figuring out how to change these institutions that are in charge of the justice system is that's the work to do right now. Yes, I don't know. That's not the. It feels kind of like an in the weeds answer. I think kind of big picture. The ongoing mobilization is happening. It's important, and for kind of as citizens figuring out how to support these organizations, which are usually underfunded, they're under attack. Figuring out ways to get threatened leaders out of dangerous situations, for example, or to kind of highlight their work in different international and educational forums. That's also really important in terms of keeping them safe and maximizing the impact that they can have.
Janice, thank you very much for joining me to talk about victim activism for Mexico's disappeared. That was Janice Gallagher, political scientist and author of Bootstrap Justice, here on Common Ground with me, Sonja. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonja, so much. I really appreciate the time.